My name is Charles Adler. I want to talk a little bit about a future that I'm excited about, and a future that may not get talked a lot about. And what I mean by that is the future that we hear a lot about usually looks something like this: an autonomous future, right? Self-driving vehicles or drones. A future dominated by AI and computers, not by people, right? Big data, cryptocurrency and Bitcoin, and I'm fascinated by all of those things as well, but the one that I want to talk a bit more about is one that kind of pulls out that unique creative talent that I would argue is hidden in all of us and enables each of us to express ourselves and find our audience. So, what that ultimately means is that there is this moment that we're in right now that I sort of look at as yet another renaissance. And you could say that that's a reference to an arts movement going back to the Medici, if you're familiar. But I think it's actually broader than that. I think it's a cultural renaissance that is empowered by technology that connects each of us. And the part of that future that I find really fascinating is one that allows the individual to connect with their audience directly. We see this day in, day out, and we'll talk a little bit about this with regard to Kickstarter. But something else that's also important to me and that has taught me a great deal is our past, our history. And I think we hear this repeated over and over again, that history repeats itself, and I think it commonly does. And I think finding those patterns in history to inform our future is also very important. So I think I'd be remiss to talk about that future without talking about history, and the history that I want to talk about leading into the origin story of Kickstarter is my own history and the history of us as co-founders. So to share a little bit about me beyond the fact that I'm a designer and a technologist and an entrepreneur, these buzzwords that are out there, I'm also somebody who is fascinated by the creative experience, a sort of bold act that a creative person independently puts their ideas out there, right? Usually gets scolded, and furiously kind of puts those ideas out there. I think that is a bold and brave moment for any individual. And so growing up, I was interested in that motivation. I was interested in that creative act. I was interested in that creative expression. And what that meant for me was being attracted to what I would argue were sort of outsider cultures. And what I mean by that as a kid growing up in the 70s and 80s was kid playing with computers, right? Anybody playing with computers in the 80s when they probably shouldn't have, right? A couple people, I hope. But that also meant things like being interested in punk rock and electronic music, skateboarding and graffiti, right? All of these things that back then were not the norm, right? Picked on and so forth, categories of art, what would be called outsider art, right? And what I was fascinated by these movements is there was a commonality. One was that tenacious desire to self-express, even though they were outsiders as well, right? They were fighting for independence and fighting for self-expression and fighting for their voice to be heard. And often those voices couldn't get heard. And that sort of brings us into this narrative of the do-it-yourself movement or the DIY movement, which is effectively these cultures and these sub-societies pulling themselves up by their own bootstraps and creating their own ecosystem, their own economy, and their own companies, so to speak. So what got them to this place? I think there was ultimately this combining mantra that we see on the board here, which is these rules were meant to be broken. There was this fight against something, and what was that something? And so if you dig deeper, there's sort of this fascination that we have globally around the industrialization of everything, right? Started, one could argue, with the motor vehicle and Henry Ford and the production line, right? And sort of taking objects to create a whole and then provide that to a consumer. And that industrialization of everything kind of led into the places that we work, right? We sort of put people in places where, frankly, machines should be, and created sort of a human-driven, industrialized society. And so where this loops back to this start of this history and this future that I'm really interested in is the fact that we've also attempted to industrialize creativity, which is almost like an oxymoron, right? And so what I mean by that, as somebody who I would argue is a creative myself, I just use my creativity through technology and through design and arguably through the development of businesses. The story that I want to tell through the application of industrial kind of business into creativity, let's pick on a couple of industries. We talked about music, and we can talk about film. And I think the thing that we see pattern over time, the pattern that we see over time is this sort of hit making, right? And if you look at the sort of origins, say, of the music industry, it started innocently enough. The desire of a fan wanting to bring a music genre to a wider audience because they just felt passionately that somebody should hear these people. They had something to say. And then what happens over time is these organizations that start innocently lose that innocence. They sort of lose touch with why they started in the first place. They start hitting a larger audience. That thing that was a niche, or was it some underground band in a garage in New Jersey, suddenly becomes a world-renowned hit. And what we start looking for in this sort of industrialized society, applying industry into creativity, is we start needing to create hits again. Right? And so as kids growing up and then maybe moving into our adulthood, there's three of us who started Kickstarter, and I think this story of sort of limited creativity is something that bonded us very deeply. And the thing that we were ultimately fighting against, the thing that kind of dovetails into the early origins of Kickstarter, was we were really frustrated by the results that we were given as consumers, and quite frankly, that we were seeing in our community of designers and artists and musicians and filmmakers that were our friends, that didn't have the rich uncle that could fund their film, that didn't have an executive that they could pitch their film to or their album to. They were undiscovered, right? And that was quite unfortunate. And so we were fighting against that narrative. And so I think one way to frame Kickstarter from an ethos standpoint is providing that creative opportunity at any scale, right? You have some weird projects that you're working on in your basement or at home or with your best friend over the weekend, and you want to get that project out of the garage, out of the basement, and share it with more people. Whether it's 10 people in the world that are interested in that inane little idea that you're working on, you have the right and the opportunity to connect with those folks. And so that was the sort of curiosity that we were working on, that we were trying to explore in bringing Kickstarter into the world. And so we brought Kickstarter into the world on April 28th of 2009, a decade ago, which is actually quite hard to believe for me, frankly. And that was the motivation, really was about empowering individuals to find their audience, to kind of coalesce their friends and their fans and their family around an idea just to get that thing made, just to bring it out into the world, just to start the process, that creative process of sharing an idea and bringing it to the world. And so I think it's important as we talk about history, one thing that I think is commonplace as we talk about Kickstarter, or frankly talk about any unicorn platform, are the big numbers, or the how many likes did somebody get, and the millions and millions of views that a YouTube video plays. But I think what's important is to talk about those early beginnings, those early stories of people taking a risk on us, on this new platform that was out there, stories of connection and community. And so I think the easiest place to start is literally the very first campaign that got funded on Kickstarter. So this is that campaign called Drawing for Dollars. It's a pretty literal expression of what the project was. Anybody want to guess what they were trying to do? Effectively draw something for money, right? What a novel idea. So this was a project by somebody named Dark Pony, male, female, or otherwise, I don't really know. It's sort of fascinated by pseudonymity on the internet. I think it's quite a beautiful thing. So Dark Pony wanted to just complete a drawing. This person would doodle, but was frustrated by the fact that there was no end game, that there was no finale to the process, and felt that if they had a client, a consumer, somebody who was a contributor to their campaign, that they would be forced by peer pressure to finish that project. So in sort of traditional, what would be tradition in the sort of Kickstarter narrative to come, Dark Pony raised $35 from 3 whole people, right? So this was like really early 2009. Now, the narrative that I was going to allude to was the fact that Dark Pony really just wanted to raise $15, so completely blew the doors off of their campaign, $35, pretty spectacular. And I think that's important to know is just it was a very innocent project, right? And many projects kind of relate to this story of innocence, which is I just wanted to see this thing happen, right? In this case, just wanted to share my drawings with people. Let's move on a couple of months. There's a woman who was a graphic design student in the middle of the United States. So this is a woman named Allison Weiss, and so she was a student. And I think what's interesting here is, again, this sort of story of multiple lives, right? By day, she was studying graphic design, so she was a designer. But at night, she had this whole other persona that probably most of her friends didn't even know, that she was a singer-songwriter. And she'd been sharing her music on the internet for a number of months, maybe even years. And along came this thing called Kickstarter right at the right moment for her, where she was looking to produce an album. And so she went on Kickstarter, and I think it was around noon on a Thursday in May of 2009. And I think the important note here is the lessons that we're taught, right? And the creativity that kind of people bring into their campaigns themselves and how they play with and communicate with an audience. With Allison, it was a really interesting story because, A, we didn't know her. She was one of the very few people that we didn't know in those days. So she was a bit of an anomaly. And she launched at noon on a Thursday, and by that evening, 12 hours later, she had completely raised her 100% goal of her campaign. Her goal was $2,000, which, again, at that time, think about Dark Pony, $35. $2,000 was like crazy viral success. And in that short period of time, raising $2,000, totally unheard of, right? We'd never seen anything like that before. And as you can see, she went on to raise over $7,000, so total runaway success. And I think the thing that was really interesting that got her to that point was this concept that is now fairly commonplace as well, which is stretch goals. So they've reached their entire goal, but she would put out new sort of milestones. If we achieve $4,000, maybe we'll do this. If we do $6,000, we'll do a booklet along with the album. And so it was all these little milestones that the community helped her get to, right? And she'd have these dialogues back and forth with her community of backers during her campaign, right? It was really interesting to watch people take advantage of and creatively utilize this little tool that we had just launched. So from $35 to $7,000, and then a few years later, along comes this project called Pebble. Anybody familiar with Pebble? Few people? Yeah? Okay, good number of people. All right. And so this is a bit of what I'm talking about, which is these big hits that people recognize. And I think this is one thing that's really important to note in here is this flexibility. Somebody can go on and start a campaign to draw you a painting, right? Just very innocently. Make 3 of them. There's literally 3 paintings in the world by Dark Pony. I don't know where they are or who has them, but there's 3 people in the world that has this scarce painting. And then you move on to something like Pebble, right? And this is arguably their second project. They had raised another campaign about a year and a half earlier. This one doubled the previous campaign. And then they went on to do a third campaign even after this one. And so what I want to talk about here is this flexibility in the platform, that somebody can share something that only goes to 3 people, and then somebody can do something like this, which is $20 million and 78,000 people around the world that were voting with their dollars to say they wanted this object, right? That they wanted Pebble Time on their wrist, right? And I think what's really interesting is this the story of flexibility, but even the story of perseverance. The backstory with Eric and his team behind Pebble was the fact he was going around Silicon Valley and trying to pitch this concept of an e-ink watch to venture capitalists and other investors. And they wouldn't bite. They weren't interested, right? They didn't understand it. They didn't think people would buy this product. Well, clearly people would buy this product. And they went on to sell the company a couple of years later, and Eric's now working on a new project. And so I think what's really interesting is, again, kind of going back to that kind of punk rock mentality that the rules were meant to be broken. The rule here that was being broken was the rules of the gatekeepers, right? Eric and everybody else that has used Kickstarter has effectively gone around all of the gatekeepers of industry and created their company, created their creative practice, created their film against the industry, right? I think this is very telling about the future that I'm hopeful for, and a future that I hope that we keep fighting for, which is about creative empowerment, right? So I want to talk about one last project that comes down a little bit closer to home in terms of funds raised, something that's a little bit more achievable, but I think one that preaches a little bit more about this possibility of the future. So it's a story of a project called Viper, and this is 5 boys ranging in age in their teens, from middle school to high school. And what they wanted to build, what Viper was and is a flight simulator. And so I don't know about you, but when I was in my teens listening to punk rock and skateboarding and becoming fascinated with the graffiti scene in New York, I was not thinking about building a flight simulator. So super geeky kids, but super passionate about this project, super technical, right? What an achievement. These kids were going to turn this little cockpit, the Cessna in the background, into a flight simulator. They went on to raise this nearly $12,000 from 383 people that voted again with their dollars because they felt impassioned for the commitment and the inspiration and the drive that these kids had. And there's one little piece that I want to share with you, which is a bit about humanity and connection and love and the act of love as communicated through what I would say is the sharing of an innocent dollar. So this was early in Kickstarter's history. This was a day where, as founders, we were sweating and up all night and obsessing about projects. And I was obsessing about this one because I was just observing the communication that was going on back and forth between the folks running the campaign and the community of people that had backed them. And there was this one comment on the project from a mother, and her comment went something like this, which was, I want to share why I'm supporting this project, why I'm supporting these 5 boys, and that is because I have 2 kids of my own, and I hope that somebody in the future sees in them, my kids, what I see in these 5 boys. And that struck me at that moment, which was, going back to the faith and the love and the trust that Allison's backers, her fans, gave in her to produce this album. And even going to the 78,000 people that supported Eric in producing something that wasn't even produced yet, and trusting that they would get it to your watch, to your wrist. Here was a woman absolutely expressing that and using the conduit of capital, of cash, to express that love, arguably for her kids, right? And so what I think was really interesting, whether these kids understood this or not, what I think she was also giving them was this appointment of courage, right? And so what I wonder is, where do these 5 kids go with that courage? Where do they get to go into the future? What future do they get to design and create and engineer that solves some problem that we don't even know that we're dealing with right now, right? And so I think it's important to note that with all of the things, all the toys and gadgets that we create, there's always a hidden meaning, a deeper meaning, right? And it's usually about connecting people, usually about enabling people to connect in a bigger society, a global society, around what I would argue is very intimate and personal ideas. And arguably, if you do a little search for India on Kickstarter, you'll find easily over $1 million raised for projects either in or related to topics of India. And so, much of the stories that I've given earlier were stories that were originating early on in Kickstarter's history and obviously focused in the US. But as a platform, we're focused globally, right? And realistically, even as a culture, it's a global culture, right? There are people of Indian descent all over the world, and they are expressing their love for their history, for their community, wherever they are, right? Okay, so this has been pretty big, right? Over the now decade or so that Kickstarter's been in existence, we've seen over $4 billion pledged. We're well over that mark, edging into the $5 billion mark probably in the next year or two. 160,000 projects globally that have been funded, and over 15 million people across the world that have contributed to these campaigns, right? And so I think the important thing here is that we're bridging people around ideas to support other people in their ambitious goals, right? Kind of goes back to the early origins that I was describing earlier about the music industry and somebody finding a band and just needing to get that band out of that little bar and exposed out into a broader world. Now we have greater conduit to do that. So I find that pretty humbling and pretty amazing, quite frankly. Okay, so Kickstarter's sort of beautiful history that I get to write. And I've left that company about 5 years ago and toying around in this, what I would say is space around creative expression. Again, I mentioned I'm fascinated by the act of a creative individual putting a project together, but then trying to share it with the world and find their audience just because they can't help but make the project that they're working on. And so I spent the last couple of years looking around the perimeter of, I guess what I would say is mainstream society, and seeing what are some of the other problems that we're struggling with as creative people, as a creative culture, as creative subcultures, in producing the ideas that we have, in getting that idea out and finding that audience. So I haven't solved that problem yet, but I'm still digging. And I think the best way to sort of sum up, I think, the perpetuity of creative practice is through the story of Sisyphus. If anybody's familiar with the story of Sisyphus, kind of displayed here in the funny graphic, which is in perpetuity, Sisyphus pushing a rock up a hill for it to forever fall down, and in that cycle kind of continues in insanity. That is the creative process, right? That is the plight of being a creative person, somebody who's creating something new and trying to bring it into the world. So there's a lot that we can fix. And so, what I was interested in was that like tenacious, ambitious individual who was doing what they were doing just because they couldn't do anything else. They just had to get that idea out there. This idea that we wanted to build a community around ambitious creatives or ambitious creators. And so I worked for a couple of months prototyping what that might look like. And the first experiments were effectively creating a space in Chicago where I live, creating a space and providing that space to a group of people in Chicago that intersected disciplines and race and sexual orientation. I think intersections are really interesting. We talked about that in the last panel. And effectively, this prototyping experiment was about building community around access to tools, access to space, and ultimately access to one another, right? Now, what started out for me as a project around physical space and providing space and tools to people, and when I talk about tools, I'm talking about that spectrum of futuristic tools like 3D printing and the like. But also what I would argue is more antiquated tools like table saws and drills and sewing machines and so forth. And that project has now taken another turn, another realization. I think this is another important note, maybe self-reflection that I'm having literally at this moment, which is the fact that as we're going through that creative process, there's some goal, some kind of fuzzy goal that we're reaching for into the future to solve some problem. We don't quite know what the conduit for that solution is. We don't know, does it need a hammer or does it need a screwdriver? Does it need a 3D printer or does it need a table saw? I don't really know. And so that conduit now that we're playing with is something that I can't actually talk about. because it's in stealth mode. But what I will say is it is internet-based. And so there's this moment now where I'm coming back to enabling and connecting ambitious creatives globally around bringing those very innocent ideas into being. And you can sort of think about it as a wrapper pre and post Kickstarter. How do we create an environment where creatives can share resources and discover resources, but even more so, create a sustainable practice, right? So more to come on that. I think with everything, much like with Kickstarter, much frankly with every Kickstarter campaign, and certainly with Lost Arts, this new endeavor that I'm working on, there is no guarantee of success, right? And I'm sure that each one of you can subscribe to this mantra. And I want to talk a little bit about some examples that sort of express that idea. And what I would say is the idea here is really about unadulterated experimentation in discovery of a solution, right? Kind of goes back to this moment that I'm in, that I'm sort of discovering through these early days of Lost Arts, this new company that I'm building. So, sort of dubbing this the state of delta that we're in. And I think what I mean by saying that is that we're at this extraordinary moment of change, right? And the change, I think, again, a lot of it is talked about through the lens of technology, like we're given a new gadget and suddenly the world's totally different, right? And the reality, I would argue, is much of the change comes from the intersection between disciplines or ideas, right? It's the combinatorial act of taking disparate things and plugging them together. And so I want to talk a little bit about what this looks like, how the world is going to get fuzzier and fuzzier through a number of experiments, and who wins we don't know. But there's something about this act that I think is really important for each of us to embrace. So I'm going to give some broader examples. So I guess maybe one question, kind of going back to this very first image that I shared, is, what is this? Is this an art project? Kind of looks like that. Is it a technology project? Is it actually a product? I would actually argue that the person developing this in this space that I had created didn't even know. They were in that hunt. They were in that sort of chaotic, creative process. And the big question is, does this thing ever even come to bear, right? Another sort of example, any cyclists in the audience? So I'm an avid cyclist, sweet. I'm an avid cyclist, and there's a brand out of the United Kingdom called Rafa. Small company, clothing company. They make very expensive, what I call sexy clothes for cyclists. It's just Lycra. And they opened a series of boutiques globally that enable any one of us to go and shop. And I say that in that way because they started out on the internet. It was a direct-to-consumer play, a lot of being talked about within that. And they felt that they needed some physical presence, and they wanted to experiment with that. And part of the experimentation, I would argue, is even in the experience of being in a Rafa store. And I think the thing to point out in this image is there is a store, there is clothing, but there is also an object in the background, a bicycle that you can ride in, right? What other store can you actually bring a bicycle into, right? It's not a bike shop, they don't sell bicycles, but you can bring your bicycle in. And more so, they have something called a coffee shop in here, right? We're clearly familiar with a coffee shop, but these things are not necessarily things that are traditionally combined, right? And there's this act, you can usually find me sitting here, leeching off of their internet, drinking coffee, not wearing cycling clothing, and frankly, not even riding my bike into the studio. And the thing that I'm doing is effectively this thing that we used to not allow customers to do, which is loiter. So I'll literally sit here for 6 hours on my computer and work because it's the environment that I want to work in, right? And so we're talking about breaking the rules and creating new rules. This is one little example that I would argue is hidden under the experience of this one brand that I would argue was an experiment for them and is a playful way for them to build community around their brand, around cycling. I think this is a really important note. So a couple of other examples, Airbnb, everyone's probably heard of Airbnb, Brian and Joe bringing this really odd idea of renting out someone's apartment and sleeping in their bed, which sounds really creepy, certainly did back when they started, but it's clearly a global phenomenon, right? And so I guess part of the question is this somebody's home or is this a hotel? right? Again, sort of this blurring the lines between what we would have described as old definitions. And the answer would be yes, it's both of those things. It's both someone's home and a hotel, just at different points in time, I guess. Another example, this is a company called Ultimaker. They make 3D printers. You can sort of see the environment that this is set up in. A guy in a very lovely sport coat. Is this a boardroom? Is this an office? Is this a lab? Is it a factory? And the answer is, like, in combination, it's probably all of those things. So the future that I would argue that we're looking at doesn't look like the past, right? And we don't quite know what it is exactly, but we're all sort of tumbling our way toward that future, right? So back to Kickstarter, there's a project, another 3D printing project out of MIT called Form Labs. And maybe this is the future of funding, right? Future of finance, future of funding, community-oriented funding, bringing your audience together immediately to fund the very early stages of a project. This was a $2.5 million campaign that was raised to bring this product to life. And then, oddly, this is actually quite disgusting, so I thought I'd share it with you. So this is the future of surgery. And I think what's really interesting about this company, Level X, is it wasn't built by surgeons. It was built by game designers, right? And so this is the combination of bringing the values and the characteristics of gameplay and the fidelity of gameplay and the expectations of gameplay into surgical practice, right? And they're killing it, not literally, but figuratively, right? Glad the joke transcends. And so this is me sort of reminiscing. I used to code more than I have in the past, and I'm sort of reconnecting with code. And so I would argue this is the future of education. I'm a college dropout, and so I have a lot to say, maybe another talk, another session around the future of education being far more distributed. But I would argue this is an example, two little examples, Stack Overflow and just YouTube, that are mechanisms for learning, right? That enable us to share the interests, share the information, share the expertise that we have at any given moment with an audience of people, right? Little side story is the origins of me coming into the web and the internet was the act of somebody, I don't even know who it was, back in the early 90s, putting up a little website called bareboneshtml.com, probably one of the longest URLs ever, totally inappropriate, totally silly. But by virtue of this person almost philanthropically sharing their knowledge in the very early days of the internet, I'm talking like 93, 94, enabled me to learn HTML, right? And we see this at scale today. And so I wonder, like, where does all of this go? Where does our future of education go? Where does the future of learning go as it's more and more distributed? So I want to go back to this kind of very bold statement. And I should admit something, I'm 45, so I'm getting a little older, a little softer. They wear me down, and I love them to death, but they wear me down. And so I find myself kind of looking at this confrontational teen in myself. And I think I still have some of that, but I think there's a softer way to look at what seems really scary, right? Really scary of putting yourself out there, taking a lot of risk. You might get fired, right, which is unlikely, but you might get fired by doing something bold and risky. And I think it kind of goes back to this story of experimentation, right? And this moment of mass experimentation that every day there's some kid putting out some new app, and maybe in 3 weeks you don't hear about it again, right? Was that a failure or was that a point of learning? And so there was this kind of edit to this bold, kind of almost risk-challenging notion that the rules were meant to be broken. And the reality, I think, in this moment, different from the moment when I was in my teens, before the internet, before all of this empowerment, before all of this connectivity, there's this realization that, frankly, the rules have always been temporary. They're just changing right now that much faster. What took generations or decades or centuries for these rules to change now are changing weekly and daily. And I think instead of that being a scary notion, I think it hopefully becomes a much more empowering notion that allows any one of us to put our little experiment out into the world, whether it's a new campaign or a new line or a new ad or a new product or a new idea, a new film, a new poem. I think it's important to put those things out there and share because you never know what journey that thing is going to take you on. So with that, I thank you.
Thank you, Charles. That was a fascinating story of Kickstarter. So here are the few questions that we have from the audience. Arun Karyal from KPMG says, what advice would you give for if somebody wanted to launch a shut up and take my money product on Kickstarter? No questions asked. How would they do that?
A shut up and take, I don't even know what that is, but it sounds fascinating. I don't know.
I don't need to read anymore. Just take my money. It's so fascinating. It's so fantastic. Just take my money.
You know, it does remind me of one particular campaign. Anybody familiar with the name Spike Lee?
Yeah, of course.
Spike Lee? Okay, yeah. Cool. Yeah. So very famous filmmaker. He ran a campaign. And I would argue it wasn't a project that was exactly that, but it was very unclear what Spike was going to do for his film. He ended up creating a film that I think was actually a very different narrative than what he was starting to kind of allude to. So it kind of sniffs of that, which was there wasn't anything definitive that he was sharing with people, but he knew he was going to create a film, and it was Spike Lee, so who isn't going to give the guy money, right?
So your advice is be
everybody, yeah, and everybody wanted to be a part of that journey, frankly. It was pretty amazing.
So if you want to shut up and take my money, your advice is be Spike Lee.
Be Spike Lee.
Be as Spike Lee as you can.
Yeah. Spike Lee can do it.
All right. Next question. What is the single most Saurabh Bhatnagar from Wavemaker at Group M. The single most creative idea that you have personally come across at Kickstarter? The one that you would say, shut up and take my money.
Yeah. That's an impossible question. There's so many. And I guess I got to think about that. You know, I think the thing that I am most inspired by is at times maybe less so the outcome of the project itself, but the experience that somebody goes through, or the experience that you can imagine them going through and want to be a part of that. So there was this one campaign that I'll tell the story of. Actually, I don't even remember the name of the campaign was, but it was this guy, Stefan Sagmeister. He's a very famous graphic designer in New York, and clearly not American, but he lived in New York. And I think he was creating a short film. And one of the rewards, so I think what's interesting about the platform, again, is like the rewards are another mechanism for creative expression. And with Stefan's project, I think it was something like for $1,000. For $1,000, and he was creating a film. So this had nothing to do with the film, what I'm about to explain. To fund the film for $1,000, you got a day with Stefan in a car, convertible. You would drive around New York, and he would just drop you off in some random place. And a friend of mine backed him for $1,000. The only reason I got this story was because a friend of mine backed, and she told me this story. And I was like, what in the world? Like, that does not sound logical. Right? Usually you get the film or you get a credit in the film, like pretty standard stuff, but you get to actually spend an hour, a couple of hours with Stefan, who is, a wild creative person, and he's going to just drop you off in some random neighborhood in New York. And I think what that speaks to is just creativity, but also it also speaks to something I think is really important, is the experience of a campaign and the experience of being a fan or being a supporter of a creative project, and not being afraid to bring people in, which was Stefan's creative moment. So yeah, hopefully that's a good enough answer.
All right, our final question comes from Ankit Singh at Leo Burnett. How is marketing a platform like Kickstarter different from marketing any other product or service? And his follow-up is, do you even need marketing anymore, or does Kickstarter just market itself?
Yeah, there's a couple of questions in there. I guess maybe we start with the last one, which is I think there is something quite fascinating. It's like we actually don't have a marketing department. We don't do any advertising. And so effectively, like every one of those campaigns markets themselves, like they have to, and by virtue of the kind of insanity of many of these campaigns, it in turn markets Kickstarter. And so there's this really virtuous loop that happens. So at least for us, I think the narrative around marketing is very, very different. It's distributed to the community. The community does it itself. I think the other question around maybe redefining marketing or rethinking marketing Effectively, everyone who's running a campaign is marketing themselves. And the difference in the story, if I can kind of play on the maybe the old narrative of advertising and marketing from, say, a Leo Burnett perspective, would be sitting in the boardroom with the executives of your client and creating a story that connects presumably with humanity, right? I think we heard a little bit in the last panel about the importance to really deeply get back to the roots and mission of a company, right? And I think what's really difficult for anybody who is not that originator of that project is you're creating an assumption around what that story was, right? And you're trying to create this human connection, but you're doing it in an environment that's probably 17 floors up with a bunch of people with suits. No offense, guys.
I am wearing a suit.
I know you are. I know it's a very nice suit.
Thank you.
And the difference is, you know, it's those 5 kids telling the story, right? It's Eric. I mean, if you were to watch the video of the very first Pebble Watch, it's almost shameful from like a quality of video standpoint, but they raised $10 million, right? And so it begs this question, is all of this fidelity and beauty necessary in certain instances? And I think maybe the difference here is that these are all like the founder or the artist or the individual that is like putting themselves out there. And I think there's this difference maybe in the narrative where I, as somebody watching the film, can innately connect with that, right?
All right, that sums up the session, and Arjun Karyal, you get the prize for the best question. His question, of course, was what advice would you give somebody to create a shut up and take my money product? Actually, the answer was as good, so maybe you should split the prize.
Oh, that's cool. What was the prize?
The prize is a collection of signature books that's published by the Times of India.
Cool. That's awesome. That's almost like rewards with Kickstarter.
You'll
that's
be
kind of
seriously
amazing.
well informed at the end of reading those books. So Arjun Karyal, if you're in the room, please contact Sudeep Garg on my right and collect your prize. Charles Adler, thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.